So we have created here in App Center 2 applications. And we have over on GitHub 3 branches. Or well, I'm going to be creating more branches. For example, I have this for the first lecture of this section, but the branches that we're going to be using are master, testers, and developers. So that means that we can now go ahead and to each of these applications sync or connect with GitHub. So every single one of these branches actually can be distributed. So I will go first here. I'm on Android. I'm going to navigate over to the Build tab. And in here, I can actually connect my repository. This is my GitHub repository, but you could connect Azure DevOps, Bitbucket, so we can actually build the application. So before going forward with this, what is going to happen is that every single time, or we could do it manually, but it's good to have it working automatically. So every single time a push happens to one of these branches, these 3 branches, we want the code to be built so the application can be distributed. So let's go ahead and select GitHub, because here is where our application is, and you can see how I'm already connected, but you would have to connect first to GitHub. And here I'm going to search for the Advanced Xamarin Finance repository. And by the way, I'm just noticing that so far I haven't made the expenses one public. This is, of course, I'm just still recording, but I will have to remember that. So I will just select the finance one that we're going to be working with, and notice that immediately we're going to see all of the branches that we have. What I want to do is go ahead and select the developers branch. And here I'm actually going to be able to set that this branch is going to be built. And we're going to be selecting the configuration, the version of Mono, and here is where we can set the build frequency. Usually I do recommend to build this branch on every push, but if you do this, you will have to keep in mind that you cannot keep pushing over and over. So normally you would have more branches for each of your features or bug fixes, and once that is done, you can actually merge to the developers, the testers, and the master branch, which we're actually going to be doing. I do recommend that you auto increment the version code so you don't have to increment it yourself. You could even set some environment variables. You will have to sign this build. We will take a look at how to do this in a further lecture, and select to distribute your builds. In this case, you can select notice the destination. And because this is in the developers branch, you will have to set this to collaborators. We're not going to be saving this yet because we do need to set how we're going to be signing these builds. Or actually, let me set this to off just for now so I can save this and actually change the build number format to timestamp. So basically what I'm doing here is setting that the developers branch from my GitHub repository is going to be built every single time we push to it, and eventually is going to be distributed to our developers. Of course, for that we will have to sign up the build, but we're going to be distributing to collaborators. For now, I am not going to be signing this. There is going to be an entire lecture dedicated to that, but for now, let's go ahead and click on Save. We could, by the way, already build, but we're not going to be distributing yet, so I'm going to leave that for a further lecture. Now let's go ahead and do the same for testers. I'm going to configure a build for this. This is also going to be built on every push. The version is going to be auto-incremented with a timestamp on it. I will eventually sign up the builds, and let me just select this for a second so I can show you that we, in this case, would be distributing to the alpha testers Android. And notice, of course, that the iOS distribution group does not appear here because they don't have access to this Android application. And that would be what we set in here. For now, let me just not sign the build and not distribute the build yet, and click on Save. And finally, for the master branch, we would configure the build. In this case, these will have to be released because these will go to the stores. Let's build this on every push, automatically increment with timestamp, set to sign the build. Again, we're not going to be doing this yet. You could also, by the way, test this on a real device, and there is actually a free version of this which will test your application first on real devices on the cloud to make sure that it does run. We're not going to be setting this on off because it does take a bit longer when you enable this. And we're going to be distributing the builds to the store. So you will have to connect to the stores because this is an Android application. You will have to connect to Google Play. To be able to do that, we will also be uploading Google Dev Console API credentials. Again, that is going to happen on a further lecture. For now, I am just going to configure the build to happen in release to automatically increment through timestamp, and we're not going to be signing anything yet. So I'm just going to click on save. So this is set up. But of course, you notice we still have a lot of things to do. All we're doing right now is noticing how we can actually build on push to different groups, some to collaborators, some to testers, and some all the way over to the app stores. And the same thing is going to happen with iOS. Let me navigate over to the iOS application. And in here, we will have to configure the build also with GitHub. Select the repository that we are going to be working on and start, let's say, with developers again. I'm going to configure the build, and this is going to be the same. For developers, this is going to be debug. I can even select the Xcode version, and notice that the latest Xcode version is quickly available, so this is updated quite quickly. I'm going to set this to build for device because I will want this to run on devices. If we set it to simulator, we cannot run this on devices. So let's set this to device build this branch on every push, again, automatically. Also, we're going to be auto-incremented through timestamp the build number. And by the way, you see that because we are setting this to device build, we do need to sign the build. So let me just, for a moment, set this to simulator build and not sign this yet, so I can actually save this. But if I were to sign this and set to build on device, notice that we can distribute, of course, and we're going to see the same thing that we did on Android, except of course in this case we will see the alpha testers iOS. So this is going to be basically the same again. I'm not going to be building yet for devices nor signing this because there is going to be a full lecture on that later. But meanwhile, I will just save this up. And just like with Android, I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for my other branches. For the master branch, by the way, in the configuration, I will set App Store. This will be eventually be distributed to the App Store. But notice that because this is App Store, this absolutely has to be built for device. And because we are not yet going to be signing our builds, we won't be able to save this. So momentarily, I will set this to release. So I can set simulator build and set that I won't be signing these yet. But something to keep in mind is that we will have to come back to the master branch and configure these for App Store. Let me just auto increment by timestamp and hit on save. So this is how we're going to be setting up here on the App Center the ability to build immediately after we receive, or actually the repo receive the pushes of code to be able to distribute. Again, you can notice how we still lack a few things in here. We need to set up some signing of the build so we can actually distribute to devices. But we have already set on iOS for developers, master and testers to trigger on push. And the same thing for the Android application to trigger on push for each of these branches.